For me, it's probably after about 90 minutes where the head and the heart seem to come together, and then the world changes at that point. Hello, I'm Gregory Day, and my new book is called Southsightedness. It's a collection of poetry published by Transit Lounge, and it's out in April 2025. This book is poems from the last 20 years. So I think of it actually as like a mycelium underneath the 6 novels I've written during that time and the music I've done. This is the daily germinating life of ideas and language moments that have been kind of sustaining me and driving me through that 20 years. A lot of them have been published in newspapers and magazines along the journey, but that's really how they function within my writing kind of life. The unifying aspect is the place where I'm living and writing, which, my novels are also often about. It's about that place. It's about the contours of that place, the nature of that place, the history of that place, and also about that place at this time in history, in human history, where so much is going on. There's a lot of pressures on places, but there's also still a lot of wonder and beauty that is still here, and very much so. And so this is also, as much as there's a darkness kind of embedded in this book as we chronicle what our species is, perhaps the damage our species is doing in part, it's also a celebration of everything in the world that I live in, which I'm just besotted by. The title of the book, Southsightedness, to me refers to a certain eclectic, collagey, multi-perspectival existence that is, I think, very much a feature of a lot of Australian life, and probably, a lot of Southern Hemisphere life in a world kind of so formed in the last few hundred years by European activity. So the different attitudes in this book, there is comic attitude, there's lyric attitude, there is melancholy and straight up, like, let's face it type of tone. But that's all the Southsidedness, because it's for me anyway, in my existence, it's all in me. So I was very, very intentional within the construction of this book to include it all, to include those variety of moods that can happen in one day, in 1 hour, or over a 20-year span, when you're confronted by beauty on one hand, the disappearance of beauty on the other, and then just in life with your family, the moods and that go on with that. The book is also kind of held up by there's 3 main suites of poems within the book, 2 of which were artist books, published as artist books along the journey. And they're doing that structural work as well for the reader. So as we know with the book of poetry, you don't have to read sequentially. But when you're building a collection, of course, you do approach it like that for your ideal reader, to go on to walk that track with you. Someone's described some of the sectioning as being like beams holding up the structure. It's time for pause. It's time to, from in the first section, then reiterate at from a slightly different angle in the second. And then there are certain kind of threads, whether they be personal threads or landscape threads. They're kind of dialogues going on, dialogues with the self, I suppose, to some extent, but with the landscape going on, which are evolving through those 3 sections. Know a river. Know a river, any river, but know a river. Know that life passes at the river's pace, that staunch limbs get snagged till they twist, and easy lissom fronds go floating seaward. Know a river's justice. Know that borders never last, that energy laps and erodes, kisses and flows, that even dry banks try to tumble towards God. Know that it takes all sorts to make a river. Busy insects, gawky birds, cluey fish, and deeply migratory dust. Parsimonious eels, old man traps, sky mirror, and rippling wake. Just as the winter into spring often turns a river to a lake. No photos of a river, no sedge, know it in a boat, know its scent from some way off. Know that life's tempo scythes through moments of hot and cold, that deepest down is coolest, that shiny river tops perform the magic tricks of this world. Know what it is to sit and cry into a river, adding yours to its, as water draws grief like a bucket at a well. Know its wild boyhood too, its jetty planks when baking hot, and cypress cubbies where your desire caught fire, where it flows and cascades. The river knows. Nothing lasts forever. Forever passes like the weather. Things flash on the scales of skin and seep houseward. All longing is natural. Remember as a kid the affinities you felt with tea-coloured streams and glittering reaches. How a river was your sister, the perfect listener, and make it so once more, to solve the drought in loneliness. Go about life with the river and its sibilant whisper, so that moments, hours and days can sow your moody spirit fields with tides and currents, with winds that go on showing you the ephemera of knowing. Well, it's really deep reading, actually, I think, when you're editing poetry. I mean, there are structural consistencies that, if there's a misstitch in that structure, if there's a fallen beam, that might be pointed out, or a bit hanging out the side, which really doesn't need to be there, which, that can happen. And you can, as you're writing a poem, there's so much about poetry where sound dictates the lines as they come. But then there's the relationship between sound and sense. And sometimes I think all writers have this, you might have said it and you say it again, but you're not trusting the fact that you said it well the first time and it doesn't need to be said again. It's probably better to just leave it. The process is a deep reading process with someone that you absolutely trust, who's skilled in poetry, who's been down that track, who understands that it is a different game editing poetry to, a narrative. Murphy agrees. So it's a different game editing poetry. So it's so valuable to have, the insight of someone else in that process. This is my first collection of poetry published in this way. I did publish a book in 2003 with the photographer Robert Ashton called Trace. People are a little bit time poor, perhaps a little bit distracted. I have real hope, and I can see it within the younger community, that poetry is firing up again. And that kind of numinous lyrical moment, which poetry can deliver, which doesn't necessarily last long, makes a lot of sense to me in this world, these poems, like a piece of literature that's one page long that you can engage with amidst everything else. I am a full-time writer, but I've always worked in other jobs as well. So I worked for many, many years in the Law and Fish Co-op, and I've worked in bookshops, and I've also taught writing, and I continue to teach writing, not within a university, but one-on-one. But even when I'm doing that, I am a full-time writer. But, if you're asking economic questions, there's always a supplement needed. My typical practice, if I'm writing a novel, is getting up early and starting early. And I would not write much after lunchtime, typically in any day, and certainly not at night. But I would write poems at any time, and when they ignite, walking is a big part of it, as it has been for so many writers and continues to be. There is a point when you're walking. For me, it's probably after about 90 minutes where the head and the heart seem to come together, and then the world changes at that point. And that's a great kind of rich zone for poetry, I find. So that's a really important part of the process. And I didn't used to think of it as part of any process. It's just what I like to do, be in the bush. But I know now that that's just you could call it, if you want to call it work, you could. But yeah, it is an important part of it. But I don't write novels on the track. You know, the novels that's up at dawn and doing that while you're freshly awake. Because there's so much you have to hold in your head when you're writing a novel. What was the best writing advice that you've been given? I think it's Rilke, whose advice to a young writer was change your life. I really like that because I don't think, I mean, writing is an artisanal activity, and there's technique. I'm very much into that aspect of it, but it is also a way of being and a way of living. And I think for a lot of people who want to write and don't, often, as I think Brancusi said, the difficult thing is not to make a work of art. The difficult thing is to put yourself in the frame of mind in which a work of art is made. So that seems to be a big battle for so many people. So that's about changing your life, reordering your priorities. And there's a lot you can do without materially if you want to write. So change your life. 2025 is a unit of time. It's a unit of linear time. And I know that, you know, there's a lot going on globally in the world, but I don't know if there's really any difference between the role of the writer in 2025 and 2024 or 1848. For me, I can only speak personally. I think for me, from the age of 5, whatever, that's what I do. I write, I sing. That's the creature I am. And so I think the role is to be as good at that as you can. Now, what I mean by that is really artisanally understanding the craft at the technical level, and then making all the space in your life for the layers, the properly layered response to life to come through. And that mightn't be typically political in its manifestation, but the very act of how you're doing it and what you're doing is in itself a response to, you know, any of the chaos going around. You know, a sustained, properly made, considered piece of work is in itself a thing to do. I'm very influenced, I think, through my bloodlines, family, through, you know, the Irish narrative and lyrical tradition coming through the centuries. I just think I've taken that kind of in. When I was at school, they asked me what I wanted to do, and I said I wanted to be a writer, and they said, well, you should go to Melbourne University and study literature, which I did, and I didn't get what I needed, what I felt like I needed from that. I wanted to know how the thing was made, but they were really teaching me what the thing was about. That's not particularly what I wanted to know. I figured I could work out what it was about, roughly, but I wanted to know how the thing was made. So I left university, and then I spent 8 years setting Yeats to music, and that was really my schooling in poetry. If you're setting a poet like Yeats to music, I was doing it on a harmonium and guitar. By the end of doing that, you understand the line and the various forms and the relationship of the poet to their society. I think you understand it really well. I had an elder brother who wrote poetry. I think that's why I thought I could do it. My grandfather wrote a book on singing, so that manuscript was around. I remember first reading Seamus Heaney's book, Death of a Naturalist. It's interesting how we read books like that, which are set in specific landscapes to the poet who's writing, but we internally set it in our own landscape. So we actually kind of compost that poem into our own world. I think that happens a lot in the inner eye. And so I could read Anna Karenina when I was younger, and I'd be setting hunting scenes down on the west coast of Victoria in my head as Vronsky was going out. You know, that's where I was picturing it. So that happens a lot. And I remember with the Seamus Heaney book reading that, and I can still see the picture of the river flat down near home where I was setting that. I remember also a really important moment was reading Colin Tabeen's novel, The Heather Blazing. And that novel is just about a very normal middle-class family. It's not a dramatic family in any respects. It's what publishers would call pejoratively a quiet novel. Often they're the ones I like the most. But I remember reading that, and there was a couple of scenes there where the judge is down on the coast at Cush going for a swim, and there's not much going on at all, and he might be just putting on his togs. And I remember him using the word togs, and I remember thinking, this is just like us. This is just like, my mum's family. So you can just write. It doesn't have to be, conflagrational. It's about people. So that was a big one in terms of fiction writing. Oh yeah, I can write about us. Because he's just writing about his people. That's important, I think. I do have a novel that I'm working on, yeah. But I don't want to say too much about it because it's still growing. It's quite a long way down the track, but it's still growing, and you wouldn't want to take the lid off the humidity crit too early because you never know what germs will get in. So yeah, that's going on, and as always, and always writing poems and so forth. Yeah, life continues, as does the writing. Symbiotic, hopefully. Thanks, Katie. It's been good.